For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Baker, and I'm an English professor here at this campus, of which one of my upper divisions classes is American Lit, and it's a 400 level class, and it's 20th century American novel. Within this class, this is the first time that I'm going to introduce here. This is Megan Pringle. She was originally Megan Clasby, but then she got married along the way during the semester, so now she's Megan. Do you like hyphenated names? Are you Megan Pringle? Or
Megan Pringle.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, what I do in this class is I try to teach literary theory, and we move through different theories. We do historical criticism, structuralism, existentialism, modernism, etc. And one of the things that we do is, of course, structuralism, and I teach William Faulkner. Now, as Alice here will testify, a lot of people do not like William Faulkner upon an initial reading of Faulkner because he writes in stream of consciousness. And of course, Megan did happen to like Faulkner. And what happened with Faulkner is he wrote a book called The Sound and the Fury, and he wrote a few other books. And people just weren't understanding these things because they were so esoteric. They were so cerebral. So nobody was buying these books. So he thought, well, I need to write a book where people will then finally buy this book and read it, and then I'll start making some money. And of course, he did go on to win the Nobel Prize in 1949. So what happened here is, I think as the legend goes, the story goes, he went to New Orleans and he was in a bar, and he was talking to a prostitute. And the story Sanctuary, of what Megan's going to present to you, was a story that he heard from a prostitute in a bar in New Orleans. And this then became a pop book. And as you all know, and I won't give it all away here, but anytime prostitutes have stories to tell, of course, word got out. And guess what happened to Sanctuary? It took off, and it became one of these bestsellers, and it really started cooking, and of course, his career took off. And then, like I said before, that he won the Nobel Prize in 1949. So anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my student, Megan Pringle, who's going to read to you her paper that she wrote for me on Faulkner. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so I did a reader's response criticism on William Faulkner's Sanctuary, and I am using the critic Norman Holland, who argues that there are three processes that an author must guide the reader through in order for the work to actually become relevant to the reader. Here we go. Critically acclaimed author William Faulkner is a self-censoring novelist, often rewriting his works entirely in order to improve material he considers initially flawed. He states, "None of my work has met my own standards. My work has all failed. It ain't quite good enough, which is the only reason to write another one." This failure he is referring to is largely a fiscal one. Faulkner isn't able to make ends meet, and he needs to write a novel that will be a guaranteed financial success. I'd been writing books for about 5 years, which got published and not bought. But that was all right. I was young then and hard-bellied. I'd never lived among nor known people who wrote novels and stories, and I suppose I did not know that people got money for them. However, this ignorance didn't last long. Faulkner eventually realizes he needs to take a new approach in his next novel, Sanctuary, in order to reach a broader audience, and more importantly, to sell his work. While his critical reviews were largely positive, his books were not commercially successful. In fact, many publishers would not become involved with his novels and short stories, recognizing that his work was too complicated and stylistic to market. Faulkner's early novels were critically well received but sold little. Sanctuary was his first financial success, though for sensationalist reasons he deplored. Critical acclaim has grown steadily until it has become something of an industry, but most of his books were out of print when he won the Nobel Prize in 1950. If he wanted to continue his career, he needed to find a new way to adapt his writing to reach a broader range of audience. Faulkner reconsidered what his audience might want from a novel. I took a little time out and I speculated what a person in Mississippi would be believed to be current trends, chose what I thought was the right answer, and invented the most horrific tale I could imagine, and wrote it in about 3 weeks. His first attempt at the novel he deemed a failure. He was displeased when he received the galleys from his first attempt, and realized that the entire novel would have to be rewritten. One of his most quoted statements concerning the first version of Sanctuary was published in an introduction to his revised edition. He says, "To me, it is a cheap idea because it was deliberately conceived to make money." In fact, the concept for the novel was not entirely Faulkner's own. Repeatedly, the story came from a girl he met in New Orleans. She recounted the story of her abduction by a Memphis gangster. The girl's story gave Faulkner the narrative material for Sanctuary and several of the most notable characters, including Popeye. However, the Gothic storyline he picked up at the bar was not the only thing he needed to captivate his readers. He also needed to break through the psychological barriers that were keeping people from reading his works. Norman Holland, a reader response critic, recognizes that there are 3 stages a reader must pass through while they engage with and connect to a piece of work. The first step of the process involves the author establishing a relationship with the reader. Holland notes, first of all, the work has to get past your network of defenses, which are there to protect you from things you fear either consciously or unconsciously. With Sanctuary, Faulkner knew that he had to break through a reader's expected defenses in order to develop a connection with the reader that would carry the audience through the entire story. Knowing that he wanted to incorporate typical elements of a potboiler, which include rape, violence, and injustice, Faulkner knew that he would have to be consciously delicate with his guidance through the introduction of his work. He needed to establish a theme of good versus evil before he introduced the demented and twisted plot. Good doesn't necessarily have to triumph over evil, but the binary between the 2 forces needs to be developed and maintained throughout the plot. Readers aren't necessarily going to be turned off by a dark and aberrant subject matter. In fact, they are often drawn in by it, but their expectations for certain characters to react in a predicted manner cannot be suddenly turned on its head. Good and moral characters must uphold their ideals throughout the novel, while the evil characters must remain wicked and malevolent until the end. Ellen Glasgow comments on a reader's willingness to participate in Gothic texts such as Sanctuary. She states, if anything is too vile and too degenerate to exist anywhere else, it is assigned to the honest school of Southern fiction and swallowed whole at bait and all by Northern readers who have never been below Washington, but who have a strong appetite. People want to read this type of material, but the author can't violate all expectations for the characters to act and respond in an anticipated manner without entirely losing the audience. At the start of Sanctuary, Faulkner describes 2 main characters meeting unexpectedly at a spring. Because of the novel's vague prose, the reader is forced to carefully read and perhaps even reread this opening vignette. Faulkner leads the reader to a perspective where Horace represents good and Popeye represents evil. Popeye is described as cold, dark, and mechanical. He saw, facing him across the spring, a man of undersize, his hands in his coat pockets, a cigarette slanted from his chin. His suit was black with a tight, high-waisted coat. He had that vicious, depthless quality of stamped tin. Horace, on the other hand, is established from the beginning as a man of God. When Popeye asks his new acquaintance to reveal his supposed pistol, Horace explains he is holding a book. Just a book, the kind that people read. Some people do. Horace is a God-fearing Christian who fights to uphold justice and integrity. This binary between good and evil created in the novel's first passage is to be maintained by its representative characters, Horace and Popeye, throughout the story. The second stage a reader must pass through is called fantasy building. Once a reader has accepted the work and allowed it admittance into their psyche, they build fantasies within the work. Sanctuary lends itself particularly well to Holland's 3rd type of fantasy, which is competition and the acceptance of societal and sexual limits. Both Horace and Popeye are in constant competition with their respective opponents. Horace is a lawyer, constantly striving for justice and virtue. He's the only character willing to represent and befriend the poor white trash in the community in order to prove the character Goodwin's innocence. Horace is entering into a competition of values because his actions go against everything his family and his social class represent. Horace's sister Narcissa is offended that he wants to stoop to the level of Ruby's and Goodwin so that she disrupts the proceedings of his trial. Not only is Horace in competition with the district attorney and his sister, but also the corrupt manipulations of Eustace Graham and the Southern ideals of his community. Ultimately, Horace is forced to recognize that he has limits and that he cannot win the defense of Goodwin. His competition is not only in the courtroom, it is also within himself. Horace, initially embattled in virtue, is forced to a recognition of his own inadequacy and guilt, and though it is a guilt incurred less by his own actions than by his inescapable association with Narcissa and Temple and other members of his family and social class. While Horace has lost the case, he is not giving up on law. Popeye, conversely, is in competition with the exploitive Red for sexual control over the novel's original character Temple. Because his mother had contracted syphilis, Popeye was born with the physical defects, thus explaining his impotence and small stature. In order to compensate for his failings, he uses voyeurism and abuse to assert sexual power over women. When he uses Red for his own sexual satisfaction, he also competes with him for Temple's loyalty. Popeye is engaged in a continual battle to preserve his domineering reputation while accepting the sexual limitations of his condition. The last stage of Holland's three-tiered process is where the author guides the readers to create public meaning out of what they read. At this stage, a reader recognizes some sort of personal significance or main idea from the work. Holland explains, you take your fantasies about the story and you take the psychological processes that are natural to you and you put them together in a way that helps you discover meaning or theme in the story. Faulkner argues that a text must discuss the intrinsic characteristics of human nature in order to give it public meaning. In his Nobel Prize speech, Faulkner states, "The young man or woman writing today has forgotten the problem of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing, because only that is worth writing about, worth the agony and the sweat." A work establishes a significance when it discusses the internal tensions that is inherent in a man. The audience initially accepts a work in to pass through their barriers because it clearly delineates between good and evil. But Faulkner creates public meaning when he addresses the complexities involved with this black and white opposition. In an interview, Faulkner discusses why audiences are drawn to this subject. He states, he is compelled to make choices between good and evil sooner or later because moral conscience demands that from him in order that he can live with himself tomorrow. His moral conscience is a curse he has to accept from the gods in order to gain from them the right to dream. It is the responsibility of each individual to make the decision between good and evil every day. Faulkner's ability to discuss these complicated themes in his literature allows the audience to address their worries and angsts of our society in a distanced manner. Robert Parks speaks to this issue. He states, somehow Faulkner and we, his readers, identify with the things we fear and become more willing to indulge in them when they are confined to a seemingly safe arena like literature. We thus become voyeurs of terror. After Faulkner establishes the reader's trust, he can begin to deliberate on the more continuous issues of human nature. At first, Sanctuary seems to offer a grim resolution to violence and corruption the reader encounters. It appears as though the good characters have succumbed to the evil ones. It seems that Horace has given in to the negativity that surrounds him. But the reader can find some sense of light at the end. After the trial, his sister is driving home, and he states, it does last, spring does. You'd almost think that there was some purpose to it. While Horace has been defeated in the courtroom, he hasn't given up on this morality and sense of justice. Faulkner has been recognized as an American novelist of unprecedented style and sophistication. But as alluded to, this critical praise was not paying dividends. Financial necessity would demand that he write a book that would sell to a larger demographic. In order to do that, he had to create something that would engage the reader throughout Holland's version of the three-tiered reading process. Although Faulkner conceded that Sanctuary was a purely commercial work, it is not without its literary qualities. We've seen that even Faulkner's phrase, cheap idea, needs to be read in the context of extraordinarily high artistic standards to which he adhered in theory from first, and which in The Sound and the Fury and As I Lay Dying he had recently set himself in practice. Sanctuary is one of his most commercial and profitable works, but it was also one of the select few that Faulkner wrote that is able to make it through a reader's defensive network before giving up on it, making it one of the few to actually establish a sense of public meaning.
Questions?
You talked about how Faulkner had to change his style to get more readership. He decided to do that at what age? Because he was younger when he started writing his other books that were more, I guess, philosophical and less easy to understand, like I said, the three-tiered reading process. At what age did he write the book you're talking about?
You know, I'm not sure what age he actually ended up writing it. I know that it was after several of his more notable and critically acclaimed novels, but unfortunately the public wasn't buying those. So once he realized that he was, you know, living fairly cheaply without much income, he decided to rework it and create a more profitable novel.
You said that he used to use trends to change up his style. So then what type of trends did he use so he can become a better writer?
Well, I would say that he's a magnificent writer no matter what work you look at, but I would say that Sanctuary differs from some of his other works in that it's a lot easier to make it through as a reader. You only have to read it once or twice before you can establish the plot and the characters, whereas some of his other works require readings after rereadings, and so I think a simpler style for Sanctuary allowed him to reach a broader audience.
So Megan,
Yeah.
do you think, or do you agree that sex and violence sells? And this is from the 30s, of course, and look at today and what's going on with sex and violence. This is something that he figured out fairly early for the American culture, and of course, it picked up on this and continued it up until today. Would you agree that he was really a predecessor of sex and violence in this particular story?
Yeah, this story is gut-wrenching, and it's really hard to get through your defenses in that. It's a dark tale, and the way he manages to guide you through it allows you to read it and to accept it and to fear it, but it makes for an interesting story in the end. And recognizing that made him some money.
Exactly, and of course, then you always want to know what happens to Temple Drake afterwards, and of course, they made a movie about this novel also. Are you excited now, or have you already read, then we talked about this in class, Requiem for a Nun, because everybody wants to know.
What happens?
What happens to this lady who's been raped in a corn crib with a corn cob by Popeye? By the way, the Popeye cartoon had just come out at this particular time also. This is part of the reason that he chose this particular character. And of course, he's smoking all the time. Notice the corn cob pipe ride is all linked into the sexual act that's going on, because he's an impotent man because his parents had syphilis and whatnot. Have you read Requiem? Did we talk about this? Do you plan on reading this, or to see what happened at Temple afterwards?
Yeah, definitely. The end of Sanctuary leaves you hanging. You get the sense that she has made it out and that she is all right, but there's a lot of loose ends, so it leads for a second novel.
To make it through your defense mechanisms of wanting to continue, because it's such a horrific tale when you find out what's happened to this poor lady, right? And then she winds up marrying that guy I told you about that took her to the bootlegger's mansion, the old Frenchman's place, and she winds up marrying him in the end, in the long run.
Yeah.
And they wind up having a kid.
All right. Thank you.